All right, if I get your attention, we'll get started. Organizational stuff at the top. Actually, there's only one organizational thing. Many people are signing up for studies and then not showing up for studies. And if you do that, so the research assistants have told me this, and this is a potentially big problem because then we can't get slots to everybody in the class if people do this. I have a feeling that the people that are signing up for slots and then not showing up for them are probably the same people who signed up for this class and aren't here now. But in the event that some of you are these people, please sign up for slots and then show up for them because there probably won't be enough slots for everybody to sign up twice. Because how do we do that, right? That'd be thousands of slots. Okay, so today we'll get started. We've ended. Yes, question. How can you tell if what? How can you tell if you've gotten credit for going? Just go to the experiment, and if you go to the experiment, you got credit for going. There's no reason you'd have to check because you got it. Yeah. Okay. So yes, question. Yes, there will be further opportunities to sign up for studies. I'll send out. You should check occasionally. I think there may actually be sign-up slots now. I'm not 100%. Yeah, there are sign-up slots now. So, you could go now. You could go when I next send out a B-Space posting. But there are slots now. So that's one option. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yep. Can you sign up for a second participation? No, not yet. I don't know that we'll be offering a second participation for extra credit, in part because of the high no-show rate. It's thrown a monkey wrench into the whole thing. And so, yes, your colleagues who are signing up for studies and then not showing up for them are taking away your extra credit opportunity. Can you believe that? The gall of these people. But again, they're not here, so they're probably not even being shamed now. Okay, so we finished the second third of the class, which is awesome, right? So we're now 2/3 of the way through the class, through this sort of journey or odyssey, if you will, to the heart of the human mind and the human social condition. As I think I've mentioned to you several times, there's a sort of arc to this class where it starts at a pretty individual level, right, with cognitive biases, intra-individual processes, things that are going on inside your head. And then we scaled up to more social phenomena, things like conformity, role-taking, Zimbardo, obedience to authority, and so on. Now we're descending back down to a more micro level. And starting with today, when we'll be talking about stereotypes, we're going to take a bit of a cognitive turn in the class as we again turn to intra-individual processes. And over the last third of the class, we'll be learning about things like stereotypes, automaticity, which is non-conscious bases of behavior. And after that, we'll be learning about relationships, happiness, a phenomenon known as immune neglect. And in a lot of ways, I think this is the most interesting material in the class. And so this is the part of the class that I think I get personally most excited about teaching, and I hope that you enjoy it. I know it can be tough at the end of a long school year to sustain attention and interest with these unnaturally long semesters that we inflict upon you, but I encourage you to nonetheless keep your attention and interest, and we'll hopefully live up to that. So, okay, so what movie are these pictures from? That's right. Can anyone here name all 5 actors that appear on the screen? Raise your hand if you can do it. Okay, all right. It's your time. Yeah, it's you. Yeah, you. Nice. That's good. That's excellent. That's important. That's going to be on the test, so that's really good. You could do that. When I was a kid, I loved this movie, okay? This was like the ubiquitous high school movie, and I was in elementary school, and I still was like totally connected and related to these students. Yes? We're not going to watch it. You saw the largest chunk of it that you'll see with just the song and the pictures. But when I was a kid, I thought, wow, this movie is so real, These kids, they have such deep problems, and they have problems with their parents, and the school is oppressing them, and I don't know, it just resonated with me, and I thought, these are real people. and they're so real, right? And like I related to them. And I was very young. I was like 7 or 8 at the time, watched the movie probably like 3 dozen times or something. And I know. You know how kids are, right? So you can watch a movie like 30, 40 times. The DVD's all scratched up, And it was obviously not a DVD, but it was a VHS. So any of you ever seen one of these at like a garage sale or something? Yeah. So this is what we used to do to watch films. And I watched it again later when I was like 18 or 19, and I was like, wait a second, these characters are paper thin. Like the movie's ostensibly about them defying their stereotypes, and Anthony Michael Hall being more than just a brain because he brought a gun to school for some stupid reason, and Judd Nelson being more than just whatever he's supposed to be, and like a burnout, but then he's totally just a burnout. And then Molly Ringwald's supposed to be more than a princess, but just because she kisses Judd Nelson doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. And I realized like these people really are just the stereotypes that they claim to be, and I was shocked. I was totally shocked and floored and was totally bummed out by this. So that doesn't connect in any particularly meaningful way to this lecture, except just to say that, that the Breakfast Club is a really good example of stereotypes that I wanted to bring up. So the definition of stereotypes we'll be using in this class is generalizations about the characteristics of members of groups. You can only see some of the presentation, same as like last week, because for some reason the display is screwed up still, messed up. Sorry. Okay, so definition is generalizations about the characteristics of members of groups. And these generalizations are applied to group members whether they actually apply, whether they're actually accurate or not. They're basically mental shortcuts, right? Stereotype. Hey, let me take just a brief break, and you all talk amongst yourselves. We'll take a 2-minute break for technical purposes, and you guys can talk amongst yourselves. Okay. Okay, all right, so we'll get started again. So stereotypes are generalizations about groups that are applied, whether or not they do apply to the individual member they're being applied to. And these generalizations are typified by being over-applied. They're based on some sort of information that you gather from your own experience or possibly from others. We'll talk about that stereotype acquisition process in more detail in a few minutes. But then they get over-applied, and that's almost the definition of stereotypes. So, well, that's the definition of stereotypes, but anyway. So any group of people may face stereotypical perceptions and judgments. There's an assumption in the lay public that stereotypes are just negative assumptions about groups, negative generalizations about groups. But this is not the way we think of it in social psychology. We think of stereotypes as any sort of generalizations that are made about groups, even if they aren't entirely negative in their content, even if they're not only directed at groups that face stigmas. So some examples of stereotypes or stereotypical assumptions that are made about individuals include union members are lazy, black people are criminal, white people can't dance. That's true. That's at least at least true in my case, certainly. Genders are not intelligent. That's not true. So, or certainly not always true. So you know, union members are lazy. I used to be a union organizer, and during my time as a union organizer, this was an incredibly frustrating phenomenon that people would assume, like, wait, if we get a union, then I will become lazy. And I'm like, really? Really? You're going to just become lazy as soon as you have a union, as soon as you're in a union. And they're like, well, that's the stereo. I assume that, right? And I'm like, really? Okay, really. So these are some examples of stereotypes. By the way, this is a lecture that in preparing for it and coming up with the examples and the images, one must step very carefully. There were many images and examples I could have used that would have not gone well. So stereotypes are often thought of as negative, but they may also have positive or neutral content as well, because stereotypes are simply generalizations about the characteristics of groups. So they aren't necessarily entirely negative. That's something people often assume, but it's not the case with stereotypes. Stereotypes include positive content, such as Asians are assumed to be hardworking and good at math. I just bought this, and it's not a very good laser pointer. This is so unfortunate. That really sucks, right? You can't see. It's pretty bad, right? I'm returning this I'm returning it. Okay. All right, great. Just bought it. Okay. So we'll go back to this is awesome, right? Now we're having a good time. Okay. So Asians are assumed to be hardworking and good at math. That's not always the case, but it is something that's assumed. And it's a positive trait, and it's part of the stereotype of Asians and Asian Americans. Mothers are assumed to be nice. That is always true, I'm sure. I'm not gonna quibble with that. But it is an example of the positive content to stereotypes. Yes?
Have you ever read the book A Child Called It?
No, I haven't. Does it relate to the stereotype of mothers as nice? Or? Yeah? Oh, okay. Cool. Certainly not always. Not always. Yeah. All right. I'm going to get right on that. Thank you. So you may be wondering, where do stereotypes come from? And the answer from social psychology is that the mind has a natural tendency to seek simpler explanations, to streamline the thinking and reasoning process. And we don't have any specific module to make stereotypes in our head. That isn't like some specific faculty. It's rather part of a broader set of faculties which involve us streamlining the cognitive process and making mental shortcuts all the time in order to navigate everyday life. So these generalizations and simplifications are really handy, right? So you've made a generalization. You've made a bunch of different generalizations about the relationship between behaviors that you do and outcomes when you drive a car, right? You know, the first time you drove a car, you know, maybe one of your parents or a friend of yours was teaching you how to drive, and they had to teach you everything, right? And everything was incredibly complicated. But eventually, you sort of gradually drew these generalizations that allowed you to do it more efficiently and more effectively. You know, like you now don't have to think that much in order to press the gas and know that the car goes. You don't have to think that much about how far down you press the pedal. You just kind of know, right? And you have an intuitive generalization about the relationship between the pedals and what the car does. Now you can do it pretty much automatically, and you don't have to think about specific circumstances in much detail. Now, that's the same sort of process by which we develop and then apply stereotypes. We develop mental shortcuts that facilitate ease of perception in the case of stereotypes. Now, of course, here, this is great. You know, being able to make these mental shortcuts about how to drive a car is extremely helpful for driving a car. But then we often think of stereotypes as being socially dysfunctional because they lead you not to judge individuals as individuals. So some other simple generalizations that you develop in the course of everyday life in order to navigate your life include, you know, when it's gray outside, it's going to rain. When I study hard, I do well, and so on. Now, this may not always be the case. Sometimes you study hard, you don't do well on the test. But it's highly functional to just have a simple read on this, a simple generalization that you can process quickly and live your life according to. You could imagine if you had to attend to everything in your future and in your present in absurd detail as though it was a completely unique circumstance, independent of anything else in the past. If you didn't have the faculty to draw generalizations and apply them to your expectations and your future behaviors, you would be overwhelmed with cognitive processes at all times. So these generalizations are very useful, but then stereotypes are one byproduct of them. So, also, using things you hear from others to develop generalizations is handy too. Stereotypes are based not only on your own personal behavior, but also on information and, that you hear from other people. So this would seem bad, right? Like, why should you take somebody else's word for what Latinos are like, or something like that? You should judge them on your own. But again, this faculty of human reasoning, human thought, is very useful in other realms. So, for example, it's nice that you can just hear somebody tell you that it's dangerous to be in public parks after dark, and you don't have to go experience it, get mugged, and then draw that generalization yourself. People can just tell you, and you go, oh, okay, I won't ever do that. I'll just never, ever do that. That's highly functional, right? Or cigarettes will kill you. You know, your parents tell you this, and if you're smart enough, unlike me, to just believe them, then you can just draw that generalization. Cigarettes will kill you. I'll never smoke cigarettes. You don't have to smoke cigarettes in order to find out. Well, there'd be no way to actually find out and then draw the generalization because you would have died. But in any event, this is a very useful generalization to just take other people's word for. But again, while that's a very useful faculty, our ability to learn from other people and take their word for things, if they seem like a credible source, can then be problematic when it leads to social stereotypes. Okay, so some generalizations are entirely useful. Stereotypes have at least two factual problems. One, they're not just based on personal experience, but also on culturally received information. So, like I was saying, we base our generalizations not just on our personal experience, but also on what we hear from other people. But this is a problem, right? Because you don't know the reliability or accuracy of this information that you're getting from other people. So many Americans, for example, maintain racist stereotypes about blacks and Latinos, despite never having known a black or Latino person. Perhaps never even having met a black or Latino person. And that's rather silly, isn't it? And then even when you base stereotypes on personal experience, either largely or entirely on personal experience, they are often over-applied, right? They're generalizations about how anybody that's a member of this category, what kind of traits and behaviors you can expect of them. And so by definition, they're going to wind up being over-applied. Like, so it might be the case that professors are in general pretty smart, but if you always assume that, you're going to end up making some mistakes now and again, I assure you. So, stereotypes based on personal experience are mostly wrong for overgeneralization reasons. Those received culturally from others likely include both sources of error because you're getting them secondhand, and the people who are forming them to begin with and then feeding them to you may have made their own personal mistakes, personal overgeneralizations. So most stereotypes come from both personal experience and information you receive from others and are sort of a hybrid generalization you draw from all information available to you, media, peers, parents, and then, of course, your own personal experience in life interacting with different sorts of people. So stereotypes are one approach to the study of discrimination. And when people study discrimination in psychology, they usually think about stereotypes as sort of the lens that they think about discrimination through. They say, oh, what happens is you have these non-conscious stereotypes, and that's how you make assumptions about other people that are often negative and unfair. In sociology, they often talk about status, right? And you already learned about status. You learned about status characteristics theory. And status characteristics theory has this whole other story, right, about how discrimination works, where there's discriminated against groups in society. These groups face stigmas. You know what those which groups they are. You then hold them in lower status. You assume them to be less competent in interactions, and then you discriminate against them. And what you might be wondering is these theories, they seem to overlap. So what's the difference and what's the overlap? Well, it's pretty clear what the overlap between the theories is. What are the differences between them? So for one, status beliefs are shared by all in a culture, right? So status characteristics theory argues that everyone in a given culture shares beliefs about the relative competence of African Americans or whites or women or men or what have you. On the other hand, stereotypes, while they are broadly culturally shared, they're also assumed to vary across individuals. Why is this? Because you base your stereotypes on both culturally received and media-based information, information from other people in your culture, and that creates the overlap with other people from your culture, but you also base them on your own personal experience. So you, for example, might have a bad experience with a poor white person or something, and you might develop some sort of negative stereotype about poor whites in America that maybe nobody else in your neighborhood has that stereotype because they didn't have that personal experience. So in that way, stereotypes describes generalizations and negative assumptions that are made about other groups of people in a slightly different way from the way theories of status do. Right, because they assume that there may be more individual level variance in stereotyping. Also, status theories tend to get very narrowly focused on competence, on how expectations about competence are kind of the main dependent variable in those theories. They say, look, there's these bases of status differentiation in the larger society. They lead to assumptions about competence. Those assumptions about competence lead to other things like allocation of lower pay, being passed over in conversations, having less influence over other individuals, and so on. So that's how status theories tend to work. They get really dialed in on how competent do you think people are. Whereas stereotypes are much broader than that. They're interested in a variety of traits about individuals. So stereotypes, yes, refer to all generalizations made about groups of people. And indeed, there are some groups where you may make no assumptions about how competent they are, but you do make lots of assumptions about other traits of them. So, for example, what would status characteristics theory say about how the assumptions you'll make about white people if you're in America? Well, status characteristics theory would say you'll assume them to be more competent than non-white people in our culture. So that's pretty much all they would say, and then they would say that could lead to higher pay, that could lead to greater influence by white people, and so on. What do stereotypes say about the generalizations that we make about white people? Well, whites are considered more competent. That's part of the stereotype of whites in America. They're also assumed to be more honest. Research has shown that. They're assumed to be really into folk music. I think there's no debating that. They're certainly more into folk music than anybody else. They're not into funk music, which is a strange decision because funk music's cooler. And they love mayonnaise. Love it. Don't love hot sauce for some reason. I don't know why. These are assumptions that are made about white people. You're all making these assumptions all the time. You're looking at me right now saying, this guy does not like hot sauce. I can tell. And it's just not true, but how can I convince you that I really like Sriracha and James Brown when I look as white as I do? So the stereotypes that are made, stereotypes about white people involve much more than just competence. They involve this theoretical approach to describing the assumptions that are made about groups is more complex and involves many more traits than just competence, whereas status theories are really dialed in on competence. How many of you are familiar with this book or website or whatever? Yeah. So this is great. You should go check this out. It's very funny. It actually seems to be specifically about like bourgeois white people in the Bay Area, you know? And anyway, if you don't know what I'm talking about, just go check this out online. It's a very ironic, amusing discussion of the stereotypes. It's a full fleshing out of stereotypes of a specific set of white people. I actually got the book version for my mom for Christmas, and she thought it was hilarious. She loved it. And then me and my cousin had this competition of like which one of us was whiter by the definition of this book. And we were like both just absurdly white. Like it was just ridiculous by the standards of this book at least. Okay, so stereotypes have pervasive effects in everyday life. They affect a variety of things, including attitudes. Attitudes that you form about other groups of people. This is not surprising. You probably already knew this. So people may assume that you're hostile because you're a young black man, or they may assume that you're passive because you're an Asian woman. These are attitudes that are formed about you or about people around you based on stereotypes that are applied to you. But also, judgments and evaluations of people are based on stereotypes. So you might not get a job because you're Latino, and the employer assumes some sort of things about you because you're Latino. Also, behavior. Stereotypes affect behavior, the way you're treated, the way people are treated in society. So someone might cross the street to avoid you at night or mistake you for a clerk in a store that you're shopping in. I was going to ask people to raise their hands if they had that one happen to them, but I won't do that. Or they might assume that you're a Republican because you're white and you're from the South, which happens to me quite a bit and annoys me. So stereotypical assumptions that are made about you or behaviors towards you based on stereotypes can be very annoying, especially when they don't apply. But even when they do apply, you know, when people are like, assume something about you that turns out to be accurate, you're like, oh, why did you assume that about me? Yes, it's totally true, but why did you assume that about me? So how do you learn stereotypes? Well, one way is media portrayals, movies, TV, video, music, and so on. you all know about this, I'm sure, well before you walked into this classroom. Another less obvious way in which stereotypes are communicated amongst individuals or between individuals is through subtle aspects of language. So in a lot of ways, language can encode stereotypes. And I think one of the ways that I think members of stigmatized groups already know this, people who maybe aren't members of frequently stigmatized groups might find this more surprising. People often betray stereotypes through what they identify as exceptions versus generalizations. So you might hear somebody describe an African-American job applicant as surprisingly articulate, you know, as though they should have been assumed to not be articulate. Or even just making light of the fact that somebody's articulate. I mean, why, you know, don't you just kind of assume everybody's sort of articulate, you know? Like, I understood exactly what she was saying in the interview. Like, wow, oh, that is surprising, isn't it? And in this way, the person has conveyed the generalization they walked into the interaction with, or the assumption or expectation, by identifying, oh, this person was an exception to what I expected. Any questions about this? I maybe didn't explain that as well as I could have. And then there's a lot of research showing that just in general, when positive traits of African Americans are discussed in our culture, that they're discussed at a lower level of abstraction, again, as though they were specific to that person, which is basically the same idea. That, oh, this is an exception, this person has this positive characteristic. One of, I think, the most interesting areas that you can see stereotypical judgments made, and I don't know why this is a sort of pocket of rhetoric and discourse in our culture where racial stereotypes are allowed to thrive like a friggin' petri dish, but for some reason it is. It's talk about sports. Like in the sports world, sports writing, you'll see tons and tons of stereotypical descriptions that the equivalent in everyday discourse, I think, would quickly become offensive and would be, like, stopped, but for some reason, they don't stop in sports. So what the heck am I talking about? So I think one example, I'm a big basketball fan, and one example that you see is that white basketball players are always described by the same set of traits, and they tend to refer basically to, like, how smart and like how much integrity they have, what leaders they are, and how just basically heroic they are. They're rarely described in terms of their physical abilities, even if they are profoundly athletic. They tend to be described as first in terms of their sort of cerebral abilities. On the other hand, African-American basketball players are described in the exact opposite way. They tend to be described first and foremost in terms of their superior athletic talents. And they often are referred to as gifts, you know, that they have these gifts that they didn't have to develop at all because it's just like you're just born strong. Of course, you don't have to work at that or anything like that. So African-American basketball players tend to be described in terms of their physical talents and not so much in terms of their mental talents. And this can be very frustrating, especially when it's like ludicrously incorrect. So some examples you'll see are white basketball players tend to be described as disciplined, unselfish, smart, fundamentally sound, a gym rat, hardworking, blue collar, the coach's son, the next Larry Bird. They're always the next Larry Bird. They have lots of intangibles. You should really pay attention to that, right? When somebody says, I can't really put my finger on it, but something about them seems excellent and better than this other person who isn't white. Anytime you hear somebody say something like that, you should be very suspicious because that thing that they just can't put their finger on might be a stereotype. So they're like, I don't know what it is, but his intangibles make me want to vote for him for MVP 2 years in a row. It's just those intangibles. On the other hand, black basketball players tend to be described with the following words: athletic, naturally gifted. Naturally gifted. They didn't have to work on it at all. No, they were naturally gifted. They were born great basketball players. Agile, fast, tall, physical, tough, aggressive, strong, aggressive. You should really look at that one. But also much more negative content to the way that they tend to be described. Lazy, head cases, poor fundamentals. They don't work at it. All that stuff. Those of you who read like sports writing, this resonates, right? Like this is sort of true, right? Have you seen this before? Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. So a couple of examples. That was really, really generous of you. Three of you nodded your heads. So, and I swear, when I read, it's like that. Whenever I read sports writing, I'm just like, oh man, it's just, relentless stereotyping people based on race. And I feel like I'm the one crazy person in a room full of people that are all like, no, he is naturally athletically gifted and dumb, like we all know that. And I'm like, can't you see what a stereotype that is? So one of the examples is Keith Van Horn. Keith Van Horn was a very good white basketball player in the NBA. I believe he's gone now. But when he hit the NBA, he's like naturally athletically gifted as well as being, I don't know that he's smart. I don't know. He's probably reasonably smart. But who knows? All I know is he can jump high and dunk a basketball, and he has athletic gifts. And he was described as the next Larry Bird, as smart, a leader, winning with his savvy, and not as this pure like athlete, which he nonetheless was, Or Larry Bird, right? Larry Bird is from like rural Indiana, When he got to Indiana State, I mean, he was like a poor farmer's kid from rural Indiana. It would be absurd to describe him as having like PhD level knowledge, or something. But nonetheless, he was described as like smart, wily, coach's son type. And in fact, Larry Bird is like a fantastic athlete. Another example, my favorite college basketball player of like the last 10 years is Kirk Heinrich. And Kirk Heinrich was always described in these terms. And it hurts me to say this, but in interviews with Kirk, I would say that this group of words comes to mind a little bit faster than this group of words. And I'll just leave it at that because it really, I love Kirk, but, I remember this one interview that I saw before a game he played against Oregon in 2003, and they were like, "What kind of music do you like to listen to, Kirk?" And he was like, "I just really like listening to Eminem because I can't believe how he rhymes words." And I was like watching this, and I was like, "Oh man, Kirk, no, don't stop interviewing Kirk," and like, because he was like, I was like, man, of course he rhymes words, But he seemed to be kind of shocked by it. I mean, and it's just that he's not like that articulate. I think he's probably a really smart guy. He's certainly a smart basketball player, but like he just doesn't come out, And like at press conferences, he'd sit next to Nick Collison, our other best player, and like Nick was like totally like the perfect kid, He'd answer the questions like he was like 45 or something, and even though he was like 20, and Kirk would be like cutting up and like writing little notes to him and stuff, and they'd ask him questions and be like, what, and so he was like a goofy kid, and but nonetheless, when the sports writers would describe him, this guy was a genius, he was elevated to this, whatever. So, or Steve Nash is another example. That guy's a smart guy, nice guy, no question. But that guy is also absurdly physically gifted, right? Like he can play soccer really well. He can do just crazy stuff athletically. And then on the flip side, black basketball players, many black basketball players are obviously winning in part through their like outstanding IQ and intelligence and their unselfishness, and yet rarely get praise for this. Michael Jordan is a great example of someone who is always people always describe him entirely in terms of his physical talents, but he's one of the smartest basketball players that you'll ever see. I mean, when you watched Michael Jordan play basketball, he triumphed in part because he was incredibly athletically talented, but he was really friggin' smart. Like, he would do creative, interesting stuff with the basketball. Anyway, I love Michael Jordan. So, I'm redeeming my prior claim that maybe Magic Johnson was better. But, okay, so this creates the irony that people used to discriminate against blacks by arguing that they were biologically inferior, but now discrimination may be that blacks are biologically superior, but whites work harder by being smart and unselfish, hardworking gym rats and stuff, which is very ironic if you think about it. So one thing that I like to do whenever I'm thinking about sociology of sport is think, what would Harry say? So do you all know who Harry Edwards is? Raise your hand if you've ever heard of Harry Edwards. This is fascinating. Okay, so almost none of you have heard of Harry Edwards. And yet if this was like 6 or 7 years ago, like you all, I'd be Harry Edwards right now. He taught the biggest class in the history of the sociology department. He taught PSYCH301 and was this absurdly famous, much-loved sociology professor in our department, one of my colleagues, and he retired a few years ago. But he's famous for a lot of reasons. Talk about a weird resume for a sociologist to have. He's famous in part for organizing the Black Power protest at the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. Do you all remember this? You seen this image? Yeah. You've never seen this image? Yeah. Well, there was a Black Power protest after two track and field athletes won a race, and they raised fists with black gloves upon winning. And anyway, they just celebrated like the 40th anniversary of that last year at the Olympics. And it was very controversial at the time. It was a Black Power symbol. And Harry Edwards at the time, he had organized that. He wanted to organize actually a walkout of black athletes out of the Olympics to protest the treatment of black athletes and stereotypic descriptions of black athletes that were common in the U.S. in the 60s and persist today. But he wound up just doing this, which is pretty impressive. This is like this iconic, amazing image from the civil rights movement. But Harry Edwards is famous for like an absurd number of things. He has like 3 Super Bowl rings or something because he was a consultant for the 49ers. He was like the first person Jerry Rice talked to after setting the touchdown record. And he consulted for the A's. He was the Parks and Rec commissioner for Oakland. He's the most famous sociologist I've ever heard of. When I got the job here, my brother was like, "You're going to meet Harry Edwards," and I was like you. I was like, "Who is that Harry Edwards? What's going on?" Yeah. So what Harry would say, he founded the area of sociology of sport, and he's fond of noting these sorts of biases that happen in the way people talk about sports. And one thing Harry would say is that race and ethnicity differences in sports are driven more by social factors than biological ones, right? Of course he's going to say that, right? He's a sociologist. Of course I'm going to say that. I'm a sociologist. But I think you can make a really good case. Because if you look across time, if you look at the history of athletics in America, you'll find that whatever the group is in America that's available to be recruited into a sport, that's poorest, that's worse off in terms of socioeconomic status, wealth, income, whatever group that is, tends to dominate sports, dominate the available sports. So if you look at the ethnic groups that have dominated baseball, I'm a big baseball history buff. If you look at the groups that have dominated baseball over its history, in the 19th century for a while, like in the 1890s, it was German Americans, dominated baseball, and people were like, wow, these German Americans are amazing, like guys like Honus Wagner. And then in the 19-teens and 20s, it was poor white Southerners tended to dominate baseball, like Shoeless Joe Jackson, Ty Cobb. Then later, in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Italian Americans seemed to dominate baseball. They were overrepresented in baseball. People like Yogi Berra, Joe DiMaggio, and so on, Phil Rizzuto. Then later, in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, African Americans seemed to dominate baseball in terms of being the most overrepresented group. Then coming into the 90s and the 2000s, Latin Americans were probably the most obvious overrepresented group in baseball. And if you were to also go back through all these different time periods and say, well, what's the most, the poorest group of people that has any access to getting into Major League Baseball? Well, that's it. That's the group that's most overrepresented. And so what you'd say if you're a sociologist, or I would argue if you have any logical faculties at all, you would say, clearly the poorest people are working their butts off to try and get a shot at the big time through athletics because they're perceiving, or maybe you wouldn't say all this, but this is what I would say, they're perceiving other avenues to success to be shut off to them or too difficult. They can't access mainstream education. They don't think they can go off and get a business degree if they're a German American in the rural U.S. in the 1890s, and they're certainly right about that. And so they're saying, but I can play baseball. I can play baseball, and if I play it well enough, I'll have some shot at being pretty wealthy. And yet, if you go through the record, the sports writing record over this 120-year span of time that I'm describing, you'll find that in all of these cases, all these groups were described in terms of their natural advantage at these sports. They were described as having some sort of inherent biological superiority to play the sport. People used to speculate, what is it about the Italian American that makes him so naturally superior at baseball? And people said that about African Americans, and now they say it about Latin Americans. And also you see this, actually one of the more absurd examples of this is basketball. Basketball started as like a New York City game, and there were lots of Jewish people living in New York City, as there still are. And so Jews were overrepresented in professional and amateur basketball in like their 40s and 50s, and people used to speculate on why Jews had this natural athletic gifts that made them so much better at basketball than everybody else. They were so rangy and wiry and quick, and now we wouldn't say that. Okay. Any questions about stereotypes and sports? Probably more on that than you wanted. Okay. All right. Good. All right. So because stereotypes are generalizations that we form so that we can dedicate conscious thought to other stuff, we tend to use them without realizing it. So stereotypes tend to be non-conscious. We tend to use them, form them, and apply them outside of our conscious awareness. And we're going to develop deeper knowledge about automaticity and non-conscious processes in the next week or so. So in other words, activation and application of stereotypes goes on mostly non-consciously and outside of awareness. And this makes it very hard to get rid of stereotypes, right? Because you don't even know that you're applying them. You know, you just apply them in the course of perception. You're like, I can't put my finger on why I didn't like that woman that just applied for a job here, but I'm not going to give her the job. And you don't even know the reason might have been a non-conscious stereotype that was activated and applied. Okay, so one thing that's been interesting in recent years is they've developed technologies for measuring non-conscious stereotyping. How many people are familiar with the implicit association test? Okay, so that's a good number. So the implicit association test is a test that's designed to detect non-conscious biases toward or against different groups of people. So the methodology works in the following way. They see if activation of a social category speeds up or maybe slows down the recognition of positive or negative words or concepts. So they'll show you, they'll remind you about members of a group by flashing, you know, black or white or Latino at you, and then seeing how quickly you recognize words that, can you all stop talking there? Yes, you, thank you. And then see how your response time when you see words that are related to good or bad is affected. And the idea is if you have negative associations with African Americans, then when black is flashed on the screen, then you'll be slower to see words related to good and faster to see words related to bad, because when the part of your mind that thinks about black people becomes active, the part of your brain that thinks about bad things also becomes active. And that's the logic. So I would encourage you to take this test online and find out how deeply and incredibly racist you all are by clicking on this link and going online. And remember that its value as a diagnostic tool, so I'm going to reverse this joke that I just said. Its value as a diagnostic tool of your prejudices remains heavily scientifically contested, though it does predict some behavior in laboratory settings and is very interesting. So go check it out, see what you think. Don't be surprised if you're diagnosed with some implicit biases, because they think that mere exposure to cultural stereotypes can lead to these mental and cognitive associations, which will then lead you to register as prejudiced on the implicit association test. Okay, so let's take a 2 or 3 minute break, and then we'll start with research on stereotypes. Okay. There's so few people, we could probably do the pass back in here. I'll just end a little bit earlier.
Okay.
How about that? Okay, cool. Okay, all right, if I could get your attention, we'll get started again. Okay. It's one nice thing about when not many people show up. It feels like a little bit more intimate in here. It's a little bit more chill, you know, y'all talking, a little more leisurely. I'm meeting these kids. This is like a great time. This is really fun. This is like my living room only with 250 people in it. Okay, so now let's talk about some stereotyping research. So I've given you some kind of basic sense of the principles of theorizing about stereotypes in social psychology. What about the research? And I'm going to give you insight on a handful of studies, and I'm interested in your feedback on them. So the first study we'll talk about is the following, about the way in which motivations can affect stereotyping processes. And the idea the researchers had here that they wanted to test was that when stereotypes make you feel better about yourself or about the world, you'll be more likely to apply them. So, for example, you might be more likely to apply a negative stereotype if somebody beats you out for a job or some competition, or if somebody criticizes you. So like that movie Crash. Y'all seen this movie Crash? Yes, you've seen this movie Crash. So in this movie Crash, that's what happens like over and over and over in the film, right? It's like somebody from some racial ethnic group criticizes somebody from another racial ethnic group, and then that person then is really racist back to them or something like that. And it goes on like that for 2 hours. So, and you might love this movie, so I'm sorry if I'm dissing it. I don't know if I loved that movie or didn't like that movie. I couldn't really tell the whole time I was watching it. So these researchers, Sinclair and Kunda, were interested in understanding how these motivated stereotyping processes might work. And they had this hypothesis that people are more likely to apply a negative stereotype to someone who has criticized them. And what they were interested in was how this might apply to teaching evaluations, right? A phenomenon that's very close to all of our hearts. Well, close to my heart, and like something you guys get to use to get back at all of us at the end of the semester. Ha ha. Ha. So they conducted a study at Waterloo University, which is somewhere in Canada, which is a country north of the United States. And and they conducted this study on instructor evaluations. And what they did was they went up to students around campus and surveyed them after grades were given at the end of the semester. And they asked students, they went up to them on campus and they asked them to go through a few of their classes and give the instructors' names for the classes, the evaluations that they gave the instructors, and then the grade they'd received from the instructor, and then also their evaluation of the fairness of that grade. So is this clear what they gathered? Get the name, the evaluation, the grade, and then their evaluation of the fairness of the grade. And what they found was that male and female instructors gave out, pretty similar grades on average. So there was no real difference in how tough male and female teachers were. And the instructors who gave students higher grades tend to be rated higher by students, right? That's a natural phenomenon that we're well aware of, that we think is one of the reasons for grade inflation. And this effect, they found, this tendency for students to give higher grades to teachers who gave them, or to give higher evaluations to teachers who gave them higher grades, and lower evaluations to teachers who gave them lower grades, was twice as strong when the instructor was female. So basically what they're saying is the evaluations of female instructors by students were much more dependent on the grades that they gave out than evaluations of male instructors were. And the title basically says it all. The title of their article was, "She's fine if she praised me, but incompetent if she criticized me." So this is a very interesting insight, right? And I think there may be specifically reasons why female TAs would face this. Teaching assistant is like the normal word for GSI. Every other university says teaching assistant, we say GSI. So, I think one of the reasons isn't just that there's negative stereotypes of women in society that can be applied, but aren't necessarily unless they're triggered, right, by some sort of insult or a low grade or something like that. But I think it's also that getting a low grade from a female instructor directly contradicts the expectations of like nurturance and kindness and sweetness that are made about women, especially women in authority positions, which I think is based in large part on the fact that people all sort of have this conception of female teachers as a little bit like mothers, you know? And so, you know, when your mom scolds you and gives you this really tough grade, then you're like, oh, I don't like my mom anymore. Or she's not even my mom now. You know, she's not living up to the mom stereotype. My God, what's wrong with her? She must be a bad TA. Then they decided to conduct a follow-up experiment that confirmed these findings under more carefully controlled conditions, because there were lots of possible alternative explanations for the findings. Like, for example, what you might be saying right now is maybe the female instructors who gave out the worst grades really weren't as good of instructors, right? Just, you know, we're assuming that that there's no difference in actual quality of instruction here, but maybe the students were right, you know? Students are often right. You guys are right all the time. And so maybe these students were right as often as you are, you know? Maybe they got this right, and when they said that the female instructors who give out low grades are less competent, maybe they were correct about that. So what they did was they conducted a follow-up experiment with more controlled conditions. And they found that getting a negative grade affected a student's negative stereotypes or activated students' negative stereotypes of women's competence. Or it may be that students were distressed. Oh, sorry. Wait, what am I saying here? Right. Same thing I already said. So in the experiment, they basically set it up so that you would receive an evaluation from a female or a male person in a lab environment, and then their actual competence was held constant experimentally. And then they concluded from this the same conclusion they basically had from the first study, which is that getting a negative grade activates students' negative stereotypes about women's competence, and particularly contradicts assumptions of women that they'll be nurturing and kind of mothering and supportive. And so you should remember this when you evaluate TAs or GSIs in your parlance who are members of stigmatized groups, because you may find that if you get a negative grade from a member of a stigmatized group, that it will activate a non-conscious stereotype which will compel you to grade them down, to evaluate them lower. So you may want to be aware of this process so that you can avoid doing motivated stereotyping processes of your own GSIs. Any questions about this? Yes, David? Yes, grade me tougher and them better. Just go ahead and just give me the worst evaluation of them all, because I'm probably deserve it. Yes? Yes, that's a stereotype, I guess. Yeah, that would be a generalization that might or might not be true in all cases. Yeah. Really? Your teacher said that? Your teacher's not supposed to say that. Okay. Stereotyping research, study 2. So this is a very, very creative piece of research that was done by Joshua Carell a few years ago and was inspired by a very, very tragic incident in New York City. And the paper is called The Police Officer's Dilemma. And here was the problem that they were approaching, that they wanted to do research on. There's a tendency for African Americans to be disproportionately victimized by accidental police shootings. And there's many possible explanations for this, right? One explanation that people tend to latch on to is they're not so accidental, that accidental police shootings that are disproportionately African Americans as victims are not accidents. They're a product of explicit racist police forces who are killing African Americans at a higher rate than they would white suspects. And certainly that might be the case. Joshua Carell had a different idea, a subtler idea and a more social psychological idea that maybe it was a product of a non-conscious stereotype activation process. And they were specifically inspired by the very controversial and well-known case of the killing of Amadou Diallo. Amadou Diallo was a 24-year-old West African immigrant who one night was standing in his apartment doorway in New York City, and police told him to freeze. They were looking for a suspect in, I don't remember, I think it was maybe a robbery or something in the neighborhood. He fit the description, even though he had his back to them, I guess. And police told him to freeze. He reached into his pocket, and the police shot 41 bullets at him. 19 hit Amadou Diallo, and he died. As it turned out, he was not the suspect they were looking for, and he was only reaching for his wallet at the time. And this is very controversial, of course, because why was he shot that many times, especially? You know, in any event, okay. So, And there were many protests of the Amadou Diallo killing. It became a sort of, it brought this problem to the fore of American thinking, political cause. So why are African Americans disproportionately victims of police shootings? Well, it may be due to explicit racism. And certainly in the past, this has been the case. We can prove this was the case in parts of America, where policemen who were also Klansmen systematically killed African Americans who were trying to do stuff like register African Americans to vote. There, case closed, explicit racism leads to police disproportionately killing African Americans. But maybe it's also due to implicit stereotyping of African Americans as more threatening or hostile or aggressive or criminal or what have you than whites. And so in the split second when police have to decide whether to shoot a suspect or not, to determine if they're hostile and going to attack them or not, they have to assess the target as a threat. They have to decide, is this suspect about to shoot me, or about to attack me? And that's the decision they have to make. And they have, less than a second to make that decision a lot of the time to shoot. And if people hold an automatically activatable stereotype of African Americans as more threatening, then that might lead to disproportionate wrongful shootings of African Americans, where in that split second you rely on automatic activations which reflect stereotypes. And perhaps these non-conscious stereotypes are part of the reason that African Americans are disproportionately the victims of police shootings. So what Carell et al. Did, and this is, I think, intuitive, they designed a video game, right? That's what you would do, right? You design a video game. So Carell et al. Did that. They designed a video game to study this, and in the game, the players would be people like you, undergraduate students at some university, basically played the role of being cops, and they had to decide whether to shoot or not shoot a series of suspects. And then these suspects were either African American or white, and they were either holding guns or other objects. It's actually a lot like those games with the gun, with a plastic gun. You have to shoot the people, and then you accidentally shoot the hostages, and then you lose points and stuff, and then you just keep shooting the hostages because it's more fun to just shoot everybody, whatever. So, okay. So in the so there's four types of people, four types of targets, and they have to decide whether to shoot them: whites, African Americans, who are or not actually threatening. And then they literally actually did have some of the white and African American suspects holding wallets, which is sort of intense. So in the first study, they had entirely white participants, and they tended to make the correct decision to shoot actually threatening targets faster if that suspect was African American. So for the correct positives, for like true positive decisions, yes, I'm shooting somebody who is a threatening target. They were able to do it faster if the target was African American, possibly because it's easier, or it was the perception of an African American target as aggressive or hostile or threatening was facilitated by the non-conscious stereotype. And then they made the correct decision to not shoot faster if the suspect was white and slower if they were African American. So sort of like, aiming at target, oh, they're African American, oh, okay, then they must be guilty, and if they actually are guilty, then they'll get it right faster. Okay. In a second study, they sped the game up. They wanted to put them under more duress and better simulate the actual conditions that somebody might have to make, or might be under when they make these kinds of decisions. Participants then were more likely to make erroneous shootings of African American suspects. And that's kind of what they were most interested in, right, is these false positives, when people decide to shoot and they shouldn't have because the target wasn't threatening. In the first study, there wasn't really any way to get false positive. The game was pretty easy. They were just like, as quickly as you can, shoot this person if they're threatening and don't if they aren't, and pretty much everybody got all of them right. But when they speed the game up, they started producing some more errors, and the victims of those errors were the African American targets. In the third study, it was the same as the first study, except they measured perceptions of African Americans as aggressive or threatening beforehand, and then they also measured the extent of contact people had with African Americans. And they found that the same biases from the first study were greater amongst those who reported having a stronger African Americans are aggressive stereotype in their heads. And they also found the bias was greater amongst those who had had less one-to-one contact with African Americans in the past. So people with a stronger stereotype of African Americans as aggressive are more likely to quickly shoot African American targets, and then those with less contact are more likely as well. And then fourth study it found the equivalent levels of bias amongst both white and African American participants. Because at this point you're probably wondering, well, what about African American participants? Would they exhibit the same biases, or is it just whites? And it was actually shown to be equal amongst whites and African Americans. I can't talk. Okay, so some conclusions coming out of the stereotyping research were stereotypes of African Americans as threatening may help explain police shootings of innocent African Americans, and also the effects of this stereotype are shared amongst whites and African Americans, but also the extent of contact with African Americans can undermine this bias, presumably because it isn't really true, and so if you had more personal experience with people, it would undermine that stereotype and reduce automatic activation of it. I'm almost certain I know what you're going to say. And let me, I'll answer your question one second. I think I know what you're going to say. And this was recently replicated amongst a group of police officers. Because one of the first criticisms you always get whenever you do experiments on undergraduates is undergraduates are not normal people, right? What's up with that? And, no one else would behave anything like undergraduates when you, from 18 to 22 or older undergraduates are fundamentally different people. They go into some sort of warp zone where they act different than everyone else in the world, and then they come back out of it and become normal. So this is an assumption that's often made about these kinds of studies, and so they replicated it with police officers. And there's a specific reason, not just undergraduates are weird or whatever, to want to do this with police officers. Police officers are trained to do well on this, right? They're trained, for years, really, to get these kinds of things right. And there was specifically some police officers were like, look, we wouldn't do that. We're trained to not do that. So then they replicated the study with a sample of police officers, and they got the exact same findings. Okay, your question, which I want to guess what it is, but okay.
So if contact with African Americans reduces bias, African Americans have the same level of bias, because I'd assume that they're not like one black guy with one white friend.
Right. Exactly. That's okay. So that's what I thought you were going to say. So it's easy for me to say now, but somebody says that every year, and I said it when I read the paper too, and I think it's like totally the obvious thing, or not obvious. It's a great observation. But so yes. So if you didn't hear what he said, how can it be the case that whites and African Americans both exhibit the bias if it's the case that contact with African Americans reduces the bias, and African Americans presumably have more contact with African Americans, right? This is logical. Maybe it's not logical. What do you think? You're lost? Bias is like disproportionately. In this case, it's shooting one group more often than the other group in this game. You know? Well, yeah, it's a game. It's like a video game where they have to shoot suspects if they're guilty, or not shoot them if they're not. And there's a bias in that they're shooting the African American suspects more often than the white suspects. A bias means, God, that's really hard to define. Are you going to help me, or do you have another question?
Oh, no, I was going to ask. Wait, so.
Okay, well, hold on if you have another question, because I'm too deep over here.
But were the African American players also biased to shoot African Americans or white? Because I thought it was.
No, the African Americans exhibited the same bias. Whatever that means. Yeah. Yes, the African American participants in the study exhibited the same bias of shooting African American targets more often than whites. A bias is when you do something more towards one group of people than towards another. Yeah.
Have you heard the story about this guy that his grandma or something like, or his mom or something like that, old lady or something, I don't know.
What?
She was in a hospital, so she was driving really fast, and then this policeman stopped him, and then he pointed a gun at him, and then he and then he's like, wait, I need to the hospital, this guy's mother died.
Oh yeah. Who is that guy?
I don't know. And then he pointed
Yeah.
at his wife, and when they were doing anything, they were all calm and all.
Yeah.
And my teacher was saying to us, and then after that something happened, and then they let him go, and then the chief saw that and got mad at the guy that was doing that because he was doing anything bad.
I did hear about that story. I did. And I do think it's a case of stereotyping. I think it's an excellent example. But we don't remember the name of the football player, so we can't tell the story to all of you. There was this football player. There was a football player, and he was pulled over by I can't. I'm telling you the story that she just told me. So he was pulled over by the police, and he said he was on his way to the hospital because he had a sick person in the hospital and his family. And he was telling his stepmom, thank you. he was telling the truth, and the policeman didn't believe him, and so when he finally got to the hospital, his stepmom had passed away. It's a very sad story. Mother-in-law. Mother-in-law is not the same as stepmom. So, okay, back to your original question. I need to answer his question. So, back to your original question. Calm down, okay? Okay, so I agree with you that it is the case that African Americans disproportionately affiliate or interact with other African Americans, have more contact with other African Americans. So, yes, this doesn't seem to make sense, and they kind of explain it away a little bit in the discussion section because clearly a reviewer caught on to the same thing. I don't know. I mean, basically, it's not a good answer, and I think it's a good point that the research probably isn't done. You know what I mean? Like, they don't have it totally nailed down yet. Yes?
I was watching a TV thing on the implicit association test, and a black person who had been big in the civil rights movement who took it and showed a preference for whites. And
Right.
his explanation
Was it Jesse Jackson?
I don't remember.
Okay.
His explanation is that there's so much media,
Mm-hmm.
and that we're exposed to that almost more often than exposed to our friends, and that might have more of an effect than people that we know.
Right. So there's a very consistent finding that African Americans also score as having implicit discriminatory attitudes towards African Americans in the implicit association test. And how can this be, right? You wouldn't think so. But the idea is we're all exposed to the same cultural information. We develop the same cognitive connotations. And this is probably why there's the same rates of, well, yeah, this is me saying that here, actually. So, yeah, the same rates of, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
And how even the black people choosing the white dolls. So it just goes back. I mean, I guess historically in the U.S. and people always say if you tell someone a lie enough times, they'll believe it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the story of African Americans being told constantly they're inferior, then they obviously start believing it and start doubting other African.
Right. So, yeah. So exactly. The Clark doll experiment and the Girl Like Me video that you all hopefully all watched are good examples of how even stigmatized groups can come to endorse negative stereotypes that disadvantage them. So at this point, we should probably try to get these exams back to you. There's going to be, oh, no, not exams. Sorry. That's why you're all doing that. I understand why you're doing that. I'll take that question just a sec. Rob. Yeah. Okay, so let's hand them back. Is it raining? Does anybody know? Okay, so let's hand them back here, out here in that like atrium-y area. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like there, where that cafe is. What? I'll tell you. Just give me a chance. Okay, so the Grand Illusion essay. The Grand Illusion essay will be handed back to you. If your last name is A through G, then Mike will have it. If your last name is H through L, then Kristen will have it. If your last name is M through Z, then Sandra will have it. And I'll have the Cool Hand Luke essays, and then Nora will have exam 1 if you need it, and we'll be out there.